Dr. Catherine Margaret Churchman is a lecturer in Asian Studies in the School of Languages and Cultures at Victoria University of Wellington, New Zealand. Although principally a historian specializing in the history of southern China and Vietnam, she became interested in Hokkien whilst living in Taiwan in the mid-1990s. She decided in 2005 to concentrate on learning Penang Hokkien, specifically compiling a word list that eventually grew into a 280-page dictionary, which is still a work in progress. She has written 2 articles on the history of Penang Hokkien and its distinctive vocabulary, the eclectic nature of Penang Hokkien vocabulary, its historical background and implications for character writing, and Native Lexical Innovation in Penang Hokkien, Thinking Beyond Rojak. Dr. Churchman studied Chinese and Dutch studies as an undergraduate in New Zealand and Taiwan before receiving her doctorate in Asian history from the Australian National University. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Catherine Margaret Churchman.
I'm Catherine Churchman from Victoria University of Wellington in New Zealand, and I'm very, very honoured to have been asked to take part in this colloquium for the centenary of the State Chinese Association of Penang. And of course, I was really hoping to be able to be there in person, but like most people who've been wanting to travel, I've been disappointed this year. So I've made a PowerPoint presentation for you, and I'll speak along to that, and you'll be able to watch the recording, and I hope you enjoy it. Just have to get it going. There we go. So I've chosen the theme Made in Penang, and I have this found this beautiful picture by Sylvia Lee Go called Nyona's Secret Recipe, and you can see she's the Nyonya is cooking up all kinds of beautiful things, and I think it makes a very good analogy for Straits Chinese Hokkien of Penang with its many different ingredients. So that's the theme of the talk, is Made in Penang. And I'd like to dedicate this talk to the memory of Baba Johnny Chi, who I used to come and visit when I was in Penang, and he was very generous with his time. And from conversations, I was able to learn a lot about the Straits Chinese Hokkien language, and it's been very helpful for he was very, very helpful for my research. So I was really hoping that I would get to see him again. The last time I was at the State Chinese Penang Association, we sat out in the garden and we watched a show, and we talked about all things Hokkien, and then we went in to watch a display of sarong and kebaya and so on. So yes, it's a great pity, and I'll really miss Baba Johnny. So moving on to my talk, I'm going to be talking about Straits Chinese Hokkien, first as the basis for modern spoken Sinkek Hokkien, and second as a transplanted language, third as a mixed language, fourth as an endangered language, fourth as an inventive language, and fifth as an endangered language. So we often hear this term Penang Hokkien being used. Actually, I used to think when I started to learn Hokkien, there was just one kind of Penang Hokkien, but Of course, I soon picked up the fact that lots of people would say to me, "Oh, nobody uses that word," or "Nobody uses this word." And I'd find that I was using a word from one of the two main varieties of Penang Hokkien, and one is straight Chinese Hokkien and one is Census Hokkien. Most people speak something somewhere in between, on a continuum between these two varieties. Straight Chinese Hokkien is characterized by a large number of loan words from English and Malay, some archaisms which aren't used, so older words that were lost in Census Hokkien. It's also, people say the accent is different, but I'm not really so sure about that. I'm sure native speakers can hear that very well, but because I'm not a native speaker, I don't hear it as clearly as other people do. The grammar is also quite different from Census Hokkien in certain respects. And as a result, it's quite hard for speakers of other varieties of Hokkien, like people in Taiwan. Straight Chinese Hokkien is harder for them to understand because the grammar is different. There are certain words and expressions that are simply not understood outside Penang and Perak and Kedah. As for Census Hokkien, the more vocabulary is shared with other Chinese languages, not just with Hokkien, but there's more vocabulary in common with other languages like Mandarin and Cantonese. Even though it's pronounced differently, it comes from the same root. And as a result, this makes it much closer to Taiwanese or Amoy Hokkien. I myself have chosen to concentrate in the last 5 years on the straight Chinese Hokkien, so that I model my speaking on people like Baba Johnny Chi, and on generally on straight Chinese Hokkien speakers. I choose words that they would use, which is great fun when I go to Taiwan and people say, "Oh, I can understand what you're saying. I can understand what you're saying." And I kind of enjoy watching their eyes glaze over after about 2 minutes when I start popping dapi and bun and these kinds of Malay loanwords into my conversation. I can't help it. That's just how I speak, but it really loses them after a while, and then they have to switch into Mandarin to talk to me. So one of the things I really would like to emphasize as well is that straight Chinese Hokkien isn't a newcomer. It's not a new variety of Hokkien that developed after Census Hokkien came to Penang. It's not a result of a recent history of mixture. These Malay and English loanwords and the way that straight Chinese Hokkien speakers speak, it has a very long history. In fact, it's a longer history than other varieties of Hokkien in Penang. So, of course, when I say this, people are going to say, "Well, why is it so rojak when it's got the longest history in Penang?" They'll think that these loanwords are a recent thing. And then you'll get people who think that Census Hokkien is pure Hokkien because it's not rojak, and therefore because it's pure Hokkien, because it doesn't have so many loanwords in it, then it must be an older variety. Or even worse, pure Hokkien is the one spoken in China. And so I don't like any of those ways of thinking, so it's time for some myth busting around these kinds of ways of thinking. So first of all, what is pure Hokkien? Well, actually, from the very beginning, every variety of Hokkien has certain things in common. And all varieties of Hokkien are composed of to start with. And this is the ones in China and the ones in Taiwan and the ones in the Philippines and elsewhere there. First of all, they're composed of what I call the pre-Chinese base. Now, this is the languages that were spoken in Fujian that don't exist anymore. But they were spoken in Fujian before people who spoke the language ancestral to Hokkien arrived there. And these include words like ba and ka So ba and ka, these are not Chinese words at all. They're not related to other words in Chinese. And I decided to bring Tang Taizong, the first emperor of the Tang, along to tell us how he would have said the word for meat and the word for foot. And he would have said it like this. He would have said meat as nyuk, and the word for foot he would have said as gyak. At least that's how they reconstruct it. And a mixture of strata as well. So you often hear, the reason why I brought the Tang Emperor along is because people say that Hokkien is a Tang dynasty language. Well, that's not actually true. Hokkien is made up of a mixture of different time strata from different periods. So you can see this in words like ask, which is mui in ordinary Hokkien, but it also has the same character is read with the pronunciation bun. So you mui bun there. And then you have o and hak. Those are two readings of the same character for study. So you have o Hokkien wa, and then you have hak sing meaning a student. So these earlier, the two first terms, mui and o, they actually descend from a form of Chinese that was spoken in Fujian probably around 300 to 500 AD. Not that they spoke like that, but these descend from those forms. And the readings bun and hak, you'll find they're closer to the readings that you get in Korean, which is mun and hak as well. And that's those date from the Tang dynasty. So there's a lot of words in Hokkien that predate the Tang dynasty. And if we asked Tang Taizong how to say those, he would say them wun and xiao. So again, not quite the same as Hokkien or Korean or at all. So actually, there's no real pure Hokkien. So even right from the very start, when people started talking about Hokkien, it was already mixed with these three different vocabulary strata. So next time somebody talks to you about it being pure, you can tell them that. So there's another thing to talk about is which is the correct Hokkien, if people talk about pure Hokkien or correct Hokkien. So here's a map of the place where the majority of Hokkien speakers in Southeast Asia, their ancestors come from. And of course, the big five surnames in Penang, they mainly come from this area, the Haiding area down here, or Samdo, as it used to be called. But you get people from other areas as well, like Jiangju and Zhuanju. And of course, later on, the biggest center of population in the 19th century was on this island here, which is, and then that became the city of Xiamen or Amoy. And that became the kind of Hokkien on which a lot of dictionaries and so on and missionary translations of the Bible and so on were based on this Amoy variety. But it's quite different from the Samdo variety. So let's have a look at that now. So I decided to pick three things that are very common in Penang: chopsticks and incense, joss sticks and a bowl of rice. And in Amoy, the word for these things is hiu, di, and peng. In Zhuanju, it's hiu, di, and peng. In Jiangju, it's hiao, di, and bui. And in Samdo, just move myself out of the way there. In Samdo, it's hiao, du, and bui. And that Samdo Hokkien, that is the what we can call the ancestral variety of both kinds of Hokkien in Penang. Even though people came from different places, they ended up speaking like this. And here we have the earliest written records of what Penang Hokkien or Hokkien in Penang sounded like. So we have a list of, it's actually a list of gangster slang from a typescript called the Penang Riots Inquiry. And it dates from 1867. There'd just been a very a lot of political instability and rioting in Penang, and this was the government report on it. And this has certain words defined. So you have hiao or hiao, a joss or incense stick. You have du for chopsticks, and you have jia bui. They've written buin because they can't say that nasalized vowel, jia bui. You actually have these forms there all the way back in 1867. Of course, when people are writing in Chinese at this time, you can't really tell what it sounds like, but here's the first evidence of what Penang Hokkien sounded like, or back in 1867. So if we look at the census of Penang, this is the Straits Settlement Census. This is actually the number of people in Penang State. Straits-born Chinese made up 10,477 of the population in 1881, and the Hokkiens made up 16,568. And now both of these people would have spoken different types of Hokkien. And in the 1891, the Straits-born have gone up by 6,000, but the Hokkien have gone up by about 8,000. So, but because the Straits-born, that style of Chinese, the Samdo pronunciation of Chinese, was already there, and by 1867, anyone who came, at least by 1867, anyone who came after this time, gradually, as they came from China, they would assimilate and pick up the type of Hokkien that was already there. You can see there were lots of Cantonese and Teochews as well, but they all ended up speaking more or less the same type of Hokkien. So we get rid of all of these hiu and de and bung, and we end up with hiao, or a special Penang pronunciation, hiao, du, and bui. So what happened was that Sinkek Hokkien is the result of Sinkek speakers trying to emulate the language of the Straits Chinese. So they picked up the pronunciation that was already there. They came from all of those different areas. Lots of people who said bung and di and du, and they all ended up saying du and bui. Almost all of them. You can still hear those other pronunciations in some places. So now what I'll talk about is why it was that the Straits Chinese were borrowing these Malay words. Of course, one of the reasons is that they needed to describe things that didn't exist in China. When people came down to the Malay Peninsula, there were certain things there that they had never seen before. And these included plants and animals. These included local foods and material culture, aspects of government, law and administration. At this time, in the 1700s, 1800s, the Qing government had a very different administrative system from the British colonial powers. So a lot of these new things were new to people who turned up in Penang. And also the customs and culture of other ethnic groups. And sometimes they would see other ethnic groups in places like Amoy because it was quite a cosmopolitan city. People would be coming and going. But generally, the earliest Hokkien speakers who came to Penang, they lacked many of these words, and the speakers had to borrow and invent new terms. So if somebody was using a word already, they would borrow it or they would invent new terms for it. And so you have words for various plants and animals that didn't exist in China. So this one is interesting because it's picked up quite a different pronunciation as well. Lun Pan Lan or pandanus leaf. You have Assam. You have Liu Lian. And this one's made its way back into China. Some of the loan words did. And you have the Mosang, the civet. Now, actually, civets do exist in Guangdong, but they don't exist in Fujian, and that's probably why they picked up this word, because the first place that Hokkien speakers saw a civet was in Penang, or in Malaya. Yeah. So another thing was local foods and material culture. So things like atap, making houses out of atap as well. Batik as well, these things definitely didn't exist in China. Dodoi and Sambai. Now these two are really interesting because they show something else about the Penang Straits Chinese, is that they tended to borrow certain types of Malay words. So what is Malay? When we just say Malay, actually we mean in quite a few different things. And it's not Bahasa Malaysia as it exists nowadays. In fact, Penang Straits Chinese Hokkien tends to emulate Kedahan pronunciation of Malay. You can see that but sometimes there are Kedahan words or Bahasa Tanjung words that are different, but they don't follow those. So that's quite an interesting feature. So for example, there's this article by A.W. Hamilton, the famous scholar of Malay and Malay dialects and Malay folklore. And in 1922, he wrote an article called Penang Malay. And it contains an awful lot of different words, but also some of the different types of pronunciation that were used up in Kedah and up in Penang as well. And one of the things he notes that a final L is often pronounced as an I. It's vocalized in Kedah pronunciation and in the pronunciation of Bahasa Tanjung. So you have words like agai. And actually this one's interesting because it's not originally wasn't even Malay. It was from akal, which is an Arabic word borrowed into Malay, changed in Kedahan, then borrowed into Hokkien. Bisui, also bisul in Bahasa Malaysia, bisui in Bahasa in the Kedahan dialect, and then same with botoi. Botoi originally from English bottle becomes botol, botoi in Hokkien, and dodoi as well. So those two, Sambai and dodoi, they're also examples of that. But what I found quite interesting about Hamilton's Penang Malay article is that it contains a lot of words that never were picked up. And sometimes I've shown people from Penang that article and they haven't understood the words in there at all. So some of these words like agak meaning to guess or estimate, very widely used in Penang. Hamilton has the word gamak for that, but actually Penang Straits Hokkien tends to be closer in this case to Baba Malay and Bahasa Malaysia. Longkau from Longkang, also a drain. Hamilton says it was parit in Penang, which is I've never heard. And layu to fade, also very commonly used in Straits Chinese Hokkien. Mala in Penang Malay. I'll come back to that in a minute. First, we'll then talk about these some other words for government and law and administration. One of them is mata. So why is it that Penang uses this word mata for police? So that's from mata, very commonly known, meaning the eyes. It's an old word for police. Of course, Malay doesn't have this, uses the word police now. So Straits Chinese Hokkien has become a museum of old Malay words. Jamban is another one where people say tandas now. I thought the Malay word for toilet was jamban and I got laughed at in Kuala Lumpur. Gombange, the word for the government. This is from the word company, or it could be the Dutch compagnie as well. It kind of sounds more similar to that. But this was the Straits Chinese word for the government. And it's not to say that in China they didn't have something slightly similar to a police or a local militia, and that they certainly had a government. But these words, what people saw in Penang was sufficiently different enough from what they had been experienced in China that they borrowed new words for it. Another word is bangsa, for different races or ethnic groups. I chose these three words specifically. This one's actually from Sanskrit originally, Vamsa, and then becomes Bangsa. And of course, you would have had different ethnic groups turning up in Amoy as well. But the idea of an ethnic group or an ethnic grouping is much, much more obvious if you live in Penang, where there are several different races living together. So it was the Malay word that became the default Hokkien word for it. And there's a reason for this. So, and one of them is that some of these words that exist now in Hokkien from China did not exist back at the time when the ancestors of today's Straits Chinese were coming to Penang. So you have a dictionary of Amoy dialect by Castes Douglas, 1873, but there's a supplement written by, I can't remember his first name, Barclay, in 1923, and it added 271 new pages of words. About 47% of the Hokkien vocabulary was, so it's an increase of 47% over the original dictionary by Barclay. So Hokkien was changing a lot over the period in the 1880s to the 1920s. It was changing an awful lot. There were lots of new things coming into China, new government, new technologies, and new concepts. I found this book in an antique shop in Chulia Street a few years back at the bottom of a box, and it was a really useful book written in 1913, Chinese New Terms and Expressions with English translation, introduction and notes. Now this was, Evan Morgan had collected all the different new terms he'd seen that turn up in newspapers and books from the last 15 years. So they were things that had come in roundabout in the late 1890s and early 1900s. And this was very useful for me when I was looking at the kinds of words that don't exist they don't have a Chinese form in Straits Chinese Hokkien. So the Chinese Hokkien words for these things, these were borrowed from Japanese actually in the period 1890 to 1910. So the word for race, nationality, and people, binzo in Taiwanese, first used in Chinese in 1889 in a Chinese book, comes from a Japanese word minzoku, which ultimately came from a Chinese, two Chinese characters in the past, but the Japanese put it together to mean nationality, tribal people. Government, why do people say gongbange? Because government was a new word as well. Jinghu was first used in 1894, Japanese seifu, to police, or to be police, gingtap, first used in 1889, and from the Japanese keisatsu. So all of those people who were there in 1881, 1891, they wouldn't have known these words to start with. So of course they were going to use the Malay and English words back then. So actually these words here are the new words, and Straits Chinese Hokkien has the older words. So, but how about these words like batu and jali and lui? Well, which actually comes from Dutch duit, meaning a copper coin. There's a East India Company coin there. Now we can't say that people in China didn't have fingers or didn't know about stones or money, so there must be another explanation here, and there is. So the explanation, perhaps one of the explanations for lui as well, is that ji, the older Hokkien Chinese word, referred to this kind of coin with a hole in the middle, and if you saw ones without holes in the middle, then you named them after the Dutch ones that you saw, duit, and hence lui as meaning money. So the reason why you have all of those extra words is because Penang Hokkien, Straits Chinese Hokkien, has been a mixed language. Now, there's a lot of evidence to show that Penang Straits Chinese, they've been bilingual or trilingual in Hokkien, Malay, and English for a very, very long time. And sometimes as a result of this, they'd lose Hokkien words and replace them with English or Malay. And I say Malay there with that wider meaning of Malay. So in Malacca and Singapore, this process eventually created Baba Malay, where the Hokkien words were lost altogether and all you had was the Hokkien structure, sentence structure. In Penang, this process ended up creating Straits Chinese Hokkien. I think it was kind of reversed by all of the Sinket Hokkien coming and as well. but at some time, it is quite likely that, or not likely that, you have references to the high, that people who lived in Penang in the 19th century, the ancestors of the Straits Chinese, spoke a lot, put a lot of Malay words into their Hokkien. So it says the Babas, especially those of Malacca, but this book actually refers to all of the Straits settlement, Penang included, so interlard their conversation with Malay words and sentences that it is difficult to say sometimes whether they are speaking Chinese or Malay. And then William Girdleston Shellabel, writing about Baba Malay, calls it the business language of Singapore, Hokkien, and the Federated Malay States. So this would explain why some of those words that are in common with Baba Malay and Bahasa Malaysia, they came into Straits Chinese Hokkien rather than the local Bahasa Tanjong words, because it was a language that was used between the Straits settlements. In the fact that it's the mother tongue of the majority of Chinese women and children in the Straits settlements. Now this is quite interesting. So they're saying that Baba Malay, actually more people spoke it in the Straits settlements. Of course, this is probably to do with Malacca in this case, because the article is about Malacca. But anyway, you can see that Malay, or a kind of Malay, was rather widely spoken back in that period. And you can see also the popularity of Chan Kim Boon. His translations of Chinese novels into Baba Malay were extremely popular in Penang. And a writer from Perak here says, it's a work that should be in every Chinese home. If it should be in every Chinese home, that suggests that a lot of Chinese homes in the Straits settlements were proficient speakers of some kind of Malay in addition to Hokkien. And you can see here we've got a letter from in Batu Gantong's translation of Samgok, or the Three Kingdoms, from someone in Penang, dated 9th of November 1892, and it's all in Malay. So, and what's interesting is that it's in Malay as spelt in something closer to Bahasa Malaysia, actually. It's not spelt like Kedahan Malay, which is also quite interesting. And as a result, these high levels of bilingualism, they resulted in all these words like tapi, balu, suka, mana, tolong, bun, and pula, and pasai. These words being ingrained in the vocabulary of Straits Chinese Hokkien. So these aren't words that get borrowed from one language to another, like the words for plants and animals. These tend to be borrowed only when two languages are in long-term close contact with each other, and there's widespread bilingualism. This happens as well now in Hokkien with people who speak English a lot. So you'll hear them saying, before wa chuki, because wa goi gong liao, like they'll start sentences like that. This tends to be, when languages are mixing like this, it tends to be because there's high levels of bilingualism. So that's how these words got into Penang Straits Chinese Hokkien. And then of course they ended up in the speech of the Sinkek as well. Not as many as exist in Straits Chinese Hokkien. Pasai tends not to be used as much. And balu is also used slightly differently in Straits Chinese Hokkien from how it's used in Sinkek Hokkien. So, but mostly all speakers of Penang Hokkien will use words like suka and tapi and so on. Yeah. It's quite widespread, and it comes from the Straits Chinese variety. The Sinkek have emulated it. The last thing I'd like to talk about is the inventiveness of Straits Chinese Hokkien. So quite often people will think about a language with many, many borrowed words as that it can't make words for itself. This is definitely not true as far as Straits Chinese Hokkien goes. So you have words like Huan Bing Lang are words to distinguish the local-born Chinese, the Straits-born Chinese from the Chinese from the Sinkek. It's a completely original Straits Chinese word that doesn't exist outside back in China. Huana Am, a word for a mosque. So Huan actually just meant foreign or not Chinese back in the 19th century. But quite often wherever people would go, the local majority foreigners or locals would end up being called Huana. In Thailand, Huana tends to mean Thais. In the Philippines, it means Tagalogs. In Malaysia, it means Malay. So Huana Am is a mosque. It's the mosque that the locals or go to, or the temple, sorry, the Am that the locals go to. And you have the word Jipwan as well, like from Masuk Malayu. So some of these words are based on Malay models, Masuk and Malayu, but they end up as distinct Hokkien terms. Jat Hong is another one of those from Makan Angin. Ji Ong Tu, the governor's house, the second king's house. That word certainly doesn't exist in China either, because there's not a second king. But that's made completely from Hokkien elements, but only really understood in the Straits settlements. And then you have wonderful words like Bua Teng De. Bua Teng De meaning what now often gets referred to as a kabaya, but the Straits Chinese came up with an original Hokkien word for that garment. Then you have hybrid vocabulary like Atapsu and Asampue and Batulo. And sorry if my accent is a bit off. And Manek sorry. And Gao Pandang. That's the only thing I could find out when I looked up Pandang. Don't cut your nails at night. And Latokong. These ones where I've put it in green, you have your native Hokkien element there, but it's attached to a Malay or Malay-derived word. So that's really unique to Penang, that style of compound words. Finally, you have words like Lumpang, Delap, Mamasak, Buai, and these sorts of things. These come from Malay or local Malay as well. But one thing to think is these we don't call French words in English corrupted or mispronounced, and we shouldn't really say it about the Malay loans in Straits Chinese Hokkien either. It's quite natural that people will pronounce words according to their own linguistic habits, and English people have done this with French, and of course Straits Chinese Hokkien have done it with Malay as well. So okay, the pronunciation is different, but if we call them mispronounced, then you're assuming that you have to pronounce them exactly as they are in Malay. But they're not Malay words anymore. They're from Malay, but they became Straits Chinese Hokkien words. The last thing I'd like to say is about the endangered language. So the language of Straits Chinese in Penang has been pulled in several different directions. And one is the Malacca Baba culture, the very well-known Baba Malay culture, and this encourages people, because there's lots of books written about it and lots of records of the language. People tend to start to use Baba Malay words instead of Hokkien words when they want to talk about the Straits Chinese culture in Penang. So also the state-sponsored cultures like the Chinese and Malay culture. Well, so when we're talking about Chinese, we're talking about education in Mandarin. When we're talking about Malay, in this case, we're talking about Bahasa Malaysia. So people will want to alter their speech and say, oh, botoi, maybe we should actually be saying botol because that's proper Malay. And that's ignoring the fact that it didn't come from Bahasa Malaysia anyway. Bahasa Malaysia didn't exist when this word was borrowed, that it was from Kedahan. The dominance of media in other languages, you're not going to see very much on TV or hear very much on the radio that's spoken in Straits Chinese Hokkien. And some of this has also led to people to be self-deprecating. They look down on their own language because it's mixed, and they don't want to speak it as much, or they will correct themselves to start saying things in English, or saying it in Malay, or in Mandarin, or in Baba Malay, or in Singkek style Hokkien. But there's nothing wrong with mixed languages. Mixed languages are very normal. English is a very mixed language. Even the word language isn't originally an English word, but it became an English word. So here's the question. If these things are so important to Penang Straits Chinese, the Buateng Te, the Gamting, the Manek E, and I forgot the word for this one, I'm very ashamed of myself, and the Asam Laksa, these things, material culture is important, then why is the language being neglected? I guess these things are easier to hand on as inheritance, material things. Language is something that you have to learn and make an effort to pass on. Because of this, it's really important to record Penang Straits Chinese Hokkien usages and words and expressions and idioms and so on. And then there's already some very good works that have been done on this topic. A particular mention again to Baba Johnny Chi's Tapestry of Baba Poetry. Raymond Kwok also has written a couple of books that contain words and expressions in both with Hokkien and the Malay element in Penang Straits Chinese Hokkien. And Mr. Cha from the Kugongsi, he's also his book has an appendix with lots of the words that are used in Straits Chinese Hokkien, the Malay words. Yeah, and there's also academic studies done by Limbing Sun and other authors. So these are very important works, but there's something missing there. One of them is that if these works were the only things to survive of Penang Straits Chinese Hokkien, we wouldn't be able to tell, apart from the Tapestry of Baba Poetry, which has sound recordings, we wouldn't be able to tell what the language really sounded like. Or what it sounds like. So recording sound, the middle point here, is really, really crucial, because all of these Malay loanwords and even English loanwords, they pick up tones and a special accent in Penang Straits Chinese Hokkien. So it's really, really important to record stories in their original Hokkien, record older people speaking about everyday life in original Hokkien. And this will give people something that they can, if they become interested in it, they can start listening to it. Acts as a kind of media for them, and they can learn words for it and learn expressions and learn correct Straits Chinese pronunciation from it. And yeah, being more proud of the language as well. It's not just a rojak mix of Hokkien and Malay and English. It's a testament to the long history and the inventiveness and cosmopolitanism of Straits Chinese in Penang. So, and of course, the other thing to do is, if you ever get the chance, is speak Penang Straits Chinese Hokkien to your children and grandchildren, and that's the best way of all of ensuring that its inheritance passes on. So I'll be around for questions afterwards, but for now, Gamsha for listening.
感謝 Dr. Churchman， 感謝姐姐。我人真正歡喜 Dr. Churchman 會來講話，甲教我人。感謝。Ladies and gentlemen, I am now honored to introduce Professor Dr. Tan Sui Beng, who has spent decades researching on the music and other cultural performances of the Penang Straits Chinese.